Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover three topics. The first one is the ongoing illegal blockade of Artsakh by the Aliyev regime. Secondly, we're going to give an update on the kidnapping of two Armenian soldiers on Armenian soil by the Aliyev regime a few weeks back. And lastly, we're going to give a general update on the economic growth development numbers that came out over the last few weeks. Let's start off with the illegal blockade of Artsakh by the Aliyev regime. We had many developments, multiple developments this week. The first one being that they, for a few hours on one day, they actually started a gas that had been shut down for months, and they immediately shut it down. This was sort of obviously some kind of a psychological game that they're playing to terrorize people. Secondly, what we have is now even the International Red Cross cannot go in and out because they're being accused by the regime in Baku of smuggling items into Artsakh, which is obviously absurd. In the media in Aliyev's country, there actually is a big media campaign to prepare people for further aggressions in Artsakh. You see it all the time. There's been constant shooting on a daily basis, both on farmers in Artsakh, military positions, and in Sunik itself. This week, there's been multiple communications between the Armenian and U.S. sides. There was a long conversation between the Armenian Prime Minister and the U.S. Secretary of State, and what the release that came out of it was very clear statements about what is important in Artsakh is to secure the rights and securities of the people of Artsakh, and negotiations between the regime in Baku and the government in Stepanakert to be moderated by international moderators, and the last one is the key word. All of this whole notion of rights and securities, which is obviously something that it needs to be the central front of all these discussions, obviously brings us to the point is how can anybody envision the Armenians of Artsakh having rights and securities within the context of Aliyev's regime when no Azeris have rights or securities in the context of the Azeri regime? You have a dictatorship in Baku and a democracy in Stepanakert, and in the history of the world, there's never been a case in which people have voluntarily gone from a free society to join a slave one. So I don't know how realistic any of this is. The only way that rights and securities can be secured is that there's no direct rule by the regime in Baku, and second of all, of a strong, vigorous international presence. What we moved on to from here is to sort of the Russian part of this equation. There was a letter that was sent by the president of Artsakh, Eric Hacopian, to Putin, outlining the horrible and the worsening humanitarian crisis within Artsakh. This is most likely not responded to by President Putin, and this actually prompted a follow-up call from the Armenian Prime Minister, probably reassessing this, going over the same points with the Russian president. What all of this leads to and clarifies is, I think this demands by the government in Stepanakert for the Russians to actually do their job is running straight ahead into the realities of what is the BakuMoscow Alliance, which is, the 800-pound gorilla in the room. And what I see is over time, this relationship between Stepanakert and Moscow collapsing over the next few weeks. And I think we're much more likely to see the direct talks between Baku, the regime in Baku and the government in Stepanakert, which the Russians are hell-bent on interfering with and not allowing to happen. I suspect that is far more likely to happen. And in fact, in real terms, that is what's necessary. And it is something that the government in Stepanakert, despite the risks, should partake in, as long as it is moderated, especially by the primary power of the world, the United States in this case. Let's move on to the second topic of the week, which is an update on the two Armenian soldiers that were kidnapped by the Aliyev regime inside of Armenia proper. There was a court in Sumgait that sentenced the two Armenian servicemen, Hartun Hovakimyan and Karan Ghazarian, to 11.5-year prison sentences, apparently for driving a car in their own country. This was obviously a kangaroo court. There is no judicial system in Azerbaijan. It's essentially a joke. And obviously, they are not been granted the position of POWs, which actually gives them some legal protection. So these are two people that are actually extremely vulnerable. Obviously, why this was done is apparently what they want is they want hostages to be traded for the one murderer of the two Azeris that crossed, the Azeri soldiers that crossed the border, and one of them murdered the security guard in Kajaran. So obviously what they want is they want to create a situation where we'll trade these two innocent people for the murderer, which is something that we should never agree to. Let's move on to the third and last topic of the week, which is the economic growth and development numbers that we've gotten over the last few days, and this covers the first 5 months of the year. First and foremost is the economic activity, which actually correlates very directly with economic growth, is coming in at 13.7%. For the first 5 months of the year. So we're likely to have an economic growth that is above last year's 2.5%, being above 13% in each of the specific areas. And again, that number in and of itself is actually incredible, and this probably puts us in the top 2 or 3 countries in the world as far as economic growth goes. Industry grew by 5.3%. The construction sector grew by 18.4%. Trade grew by 28.8%. The service industries grew by 12.3%. And one of the notable things that stood out was diamond processing exports that actually has gone up by 400%. We went from somewhere in a little over $100 million for the first 3-4 months of the year to close to $500 million. And this is actually one of the untalked about industries in Armenia. You have these large sites in which people do diamond cutting, especially outside of Yerevan. All of this has correlated into tax revenues being up for the first 6 months of the year by 24%, which in real terms means that your budget goes up by that amount, which is actually a tremendous level of growth, and obviously allows this country to do a lot more things that it needs to get done. Moving on with these statistics, the one thing that also stood out was the per capita income in the country that actually reached $8,000 already. And this was a number that, according to the IMF, we were actually supposed to hit in 2028, and we've already hit it 5 years ahead of schedule. One of the leading industries, which is growing leaps and bounds, is tourism. In the first 6 months of the year, we had 1 million visitors, which makes this, we're likely to head to a record-breaking year in tourists coming into this country. And but I think we need to be careful with this. Tourism growth is actually very good, but you certainly do not want it to be the primary industry in the country, because once you do that, you end up essentially creating a nation of waiters. It's good to have growth in this area, but it should never be our primary mode of development. On the economic front, there was actually a side story that was quite fascinating. It has involved the giant Dutch-English oil company Shell, which actually is moving into the Armenian market. And they actually set up the first of 25 stations that they're building around the country. And this actually comes from a few things. I've been following the story for a while. That actually, this came out of a very aggressive work of our diplomatic corps, especially our ambassador in Holland, Balayan, who's exceptionally aggressive and actually delivered on this when many people thought it wouldn't be possible. However, you might ask, why is this important? In the big scheme of things, 25 gas stations really don't change anything. But in this case, this actually has significant secondary effects. First of all, for Shell to actually put its brand at risk and actually invest somewhere usually means two things. Which means that in their very thorough security analysis, they see the country as a safe place to invest. And I think this is what's good about it. This is something that can be used with other firms to be brought into this country. And we have the example of NVIDIA from last year, which is a big chip design company. And it's something that sort of, opens the door for other firms. And secondly, it really means that you actually have a growing middle class that can actually use these services, because these are not just your normal gas stations. They actually offer many other services. And what we're really looking at is by bringing or attracting multinationals to Armenia. Now, we had talked about mining for security. This is actually investment for security, and this is something that should be one of the things that we are pushing at, not only as a governmental policy, but as a collective from the Armenian nation as a whole. In conclusion, why are we looking at these economic numbers? You can talk about the very clear security issues or emergencies that we have, the horrible situation in Artsakh, but you have to look at it. Sometimes you have to step back and look at it more holistically. All of the security problems that we have today stem from our weakness, and the weakness actually comes from not being strong enough or rich enough to do what you need to do for you. And Armenia, that is richer, integrated into the world, and has foreign investors working here, is a much more secure Armenia. What pales today, or what we miss today in these economic development numbers, are what really matters 20 years from now, and even some of today's problems might look very small. When you look back, if you could actually transform the country economically and keep the economic growth that we're going, it is something that will lead to a stronger Armenia. The road to a secure Armenia is to create a rich Armenia. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insights.
Money, money, money must be funny.